Welcome to #VOA. I'm Michael Lippin with Andrew Palchevsky. Andrew, what's trending today?
Lots of stuff trending today. It's the Paris Climate Change Summit, the World's AIDS Day, Giving Tuesday. But today we're talking about the ongoing doping scandal around the world.
That's right. We are going to look at the impact of those scandals with a great panel of guests. We have one in our DC studio, one in New England, and one in the UK. And we're going to talk to them as soon as you do that thing that you do.
That thing I do. Roll it, Steve.
Welcome to #VOA. I'm Michael Lippin. Russia and Kenya are feeling the pressure as their athletes are being investigated on doping charges. Russia's sports minister met the World Anti-Doping Agency chief last Friday and promised anti-doping reforms. 3 of Kenya's top athletics officials also just received suspensions from the International Association of Athletics Federations. Here's a look at how Kenya and Russia got to this point. Former head of the World Anti-Doping Agency, Dick Pound, turned the eyes of the sporting world toward Russia last month, releasing a report accusing Moscow of running a state-sponsored doping program. The global anti-doping body, known as WADA, responded to Pound's report by suspending the accreditation of Russia's own anti-doping agency. The International Association of Athletics Federations also took Pound's advice and suspended the Russian Athletics Federation, barring Russian athletes from international competition. It was a move that puts Russia's whole athletics team in jeopardy of missing next year's Olympic Games in Rio, a risk that Pound said the Russians need to take seriously.
Say this, if they want to be there for Rio, they got to really act. They got to bite the bullet and they got to go full speed ahead in order to get all this done in time for Rio.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has already taken steps to comply, ordering Russian officials to cooperate with international sports bodies. And that means working with a team of IAAF experts whose mission is to verify that Russia's Athletics Federation takes the necessary anti-doping steps to end its international suspension. Kenya also has been under suspicion for doping since August, when European media published IAAF data of suspicious blood samples from medal-winning athletes, many of them Kenyans. Pound has been working on a separate investigation into that scandal, and he says the evidence of Kenyan doping is overwhelming.
I mean, now they have to do something about it because, the risk is that the country will be declared non-compliant. And you won't have any more Kenyans in the Olympics or in the marathons and so forth. That's a big deal for them.
Kenyan athletes, fearful of missing out on those events, have been turning their anger toward Kenya's Athletics Federation. Dozens of them protested at the federation's headquarters in Nairobi last week, demanding the resignation of top officials they accuse of corruption. Those officials later suspended 7 more athletes for doping offenses, bringing the total number of suspended Kenyan athletes to 40 over the past 3 years. The IAAF also is facing scrutiny for not doing more to crack down on doping by Russian, Kenyan, and other athletes. French prosecutors have charged the body's previous president, Lamine Diack, with accepting bribes to cover up Russian doping cases. More accusations of IAAF corruption could be revealed in January, when Pound plans to release the next part of his findings. Cleaning up the organization is now the top priority for Diak's successor as IAAF chief, Sebastian Coe, who took over the post earlier this year.
I am entirely focused on the changes that need to be made. We have conceded, and I openly concede, that we need to learn some very, very tough lessons. This is a wake-up call for all of us. We need to look at ourselves within our sport, my organisation as well, and we will do that. Thank you very much indeed.
Now let's turn to our Andrew Palchevsky, who is following this issue on social media. Andrew, what do you have today?
Well, of all the people weighing in on this doping scandal, Michael, one group is perhaps affected more than any other: athletes. And many of them are taking to social media to speak out, using #CleanSport and #CleanAthletics to call for more testing and increased efforts to enforce the ban on performance-enhancing drugs. One of the loudest advocates has been Paula Radcliffe, the world record holder in the women's marathon. Radcliffe was herself accused of doping, but was ultimately cleared of the charges just last week. She sees the battle against doping as not just a fight for fairness, but a fight for the integrity and future of athletic competition. For Alicia Montano, a U.S. runner, the issue hits especially close to home. She placed 5th in the 800-meter race at the 2012 Olympic Games, but 2 of the athletes that placed ahead of her, both of them Russian, were found to be doping, meaning she could retroactively receive the bronze medal if they're disqualified. She implores track and field fans and officials to discuss doping and change the culture of cheating. The advocacy isn't just confined to running. Josh Salmon is a fighter in the UFC, the Mixed Martial Arts League here in the U.S. He tweets out this email he received from the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, showing that he's free from any illegal performance-enhancing substances, and he thanks them for working to keep his sport clean. In our next segment, we'll look at how the scandal that started in Russia has now gone global. Michael?
Thanks so much, Andrew. So I'd like to bring in our panelists for this program, and we're going to have a deeper dive into the issue. Joining us today in the DC studio, we have David Larkin. He is an international sport lawyer. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
We also have via Skype from Portland, Maine, Scott Douglas. He is a senior content editor at Runner's World. Hi, Scott. And we also have on Skype from Birmingham, England, Ellis Cashmore. He is a sociology professor at Aston University. Hi, Ellis. Well, thanks, everyone. I wanted to start with Dave here in the studio, and I wanted to find out from you what chance Russia has of cleaning up its act in order to get its athletes into the Olympics in Rio next year.
Well, I think the allegations at this point are very, very serious, as leveled by Dick Pound and the Commission. And so I think you've got, what's interesting to watch is the movement where they first said that Russia should be banned, and now they seem to be backing off that charge. And so the question is what's Russia going to do, and what is IAAF going to hold Russia and the Russian athletics accountable for?
Well, what do you think the IAAF will do with Russia?
I think it's uncertain at this point. I think it could go either way. And I think we're seeing some political pressure applied out of Russia. But the allegations go to the very top in Russia. And so, I mean, you're talking about some of the very people who are charged with cleaning things up are also the people who have some real questions to answer. And so I think it's really uncertain at this point.
Well, I'd like to turn now to Scott Douglas in Maine. I'd like to get a sense from you about what the World Anti-Doping Agency and the IAAF are actually asking Russia to do here.
So the IAAF has establishing a committee to detail the steps that Russia would need to do to show that it can be in compliance with the World Anti-Doping Agency code. The challenge will be that they will have to pretty much start from scratch, given the allegations that were in the WADA report last month. So the exact steps have not been specified yet. They are expected to be announced in late March, which really starts getting towards pretty close to then how would they meet all those steps in order to compete in the Olympics in August.
Well, what do you think are the chances that Russia will meet those obligations?
I would, if I had to bet today, I would say that there won't be a Russian track and field team at the Olympics on the grounds that the allegations, the evidence in the report was so damning that to then say that within 4 months they were able to clean up all of that, that would look really, really bad for a sport that has said that we are going to do whatever it takes to get to a point of clean sport.
Well, I've got a question now for Ellis Cashmore. Let's turn it around to the World Anti-Doping Agency and the IAAF. How serious do you think they are about getting Russia to clean up its act?
Well, I think that they've got to, for the sake of show, signal that they are entirely serious about this. But I'm not sure I go along with Scott and I predict that they would exclude Russia from the Rio Olympics. I think that would be a draconian step and probably a step too far. Consider this. If they kick out Russia, saying, clean up your act, we've given you enough warnings, and we have a damning report, and you haven't got time to turn it around, so you are out of the Olympics and probably the next World Championships the following year. Russia may say, hang on, okay, if we're taking the hit for this, what about Kenya? What about the United States? What about Jamaica? And really, we have a domino effect. Now, what happens in that situation is that the sponsors of track and field begin to get worried about this and say, hang on, what good is an Olympics for us, for marketing purposes, if we don't have the powers where our markets lie being displayed on the screen every day for 3 weeks? So I think then the masters, and let's not kid ourselves, the real masters of track and field at the moment are the sponsors, the likes of Canon and Seiko and Toyota. And these are where the millions are coming from. And I think that they're calling the shots. So I think they will say, go a little bit easy on Russia, give them a slap on the wrist and allow them to come back. And maybe over the next couple of years, people will forget about all this.
Well, Dave Larkin here in the studio, Ellis did bring up Kenya.
Right.
And Kenya seems to be the one African nation most under fire for doping. Why do you think Kenya is having such problems at the moment?
Well, I think, you look at the track record in the last 3 years. I think we're now up to, 40 athletes that have allegations of doping leveled against them and or bans. And so it's really been a hot spot. And with the latest allegations against the senior leadership, I mean, we had the athletes storm the federation this past week. Something seriously wrong in Kenya. It's been known for a while, and it's finally come to the forefront.
Right, and we're going to look at how sponsors are reacting to this situation when we come back, but we've got to take a short break. Stay with #VOA.
Tweet us at #VOA.
I'm Milar Sega. I'm the host of VOA's The Correspondents, a roundup of the world's top stories with analysis from our dedicated reporters. It's really a conversation the same way that you would bring a friend to your home and ask them what's going on. And our correspondents will do that and answer those questions through their own eyes.
That appears a false choice in more ways than one.
We can't actually put you there, but we can come pretty close. In 30 minutes, we'll show you the world.
I'm Sonny Young from the sunny side of sports, and this is VOA. Follow us on Africa 54. Go to facebook.com/VOA Africa 54.
Welcome back to #VOA. I'm Michael Lippin. Well, Andrew Palchevsky is back with us for more reaction to these scandals on social media. Andrew.
Absolutely, Michael. It started, of course, with a ban on the Russian athletes and accusations of Russian doping. But now this scandal has gone global, with more athletes and officials being banned and more fallout around the world. Rick Broadbent, a sports writer for the Times of London, comments on a recent development that we discussed. After they voted to ban Russian athletic officials, several Kenyan athletic officials were themselves banned by the International Association of Athletics Federations, or IAAF, for a doping cover-up, a situation he says is getting close to parity. A Ukrainian runner, Tatiana Hamera-Shmirko, was also banned this past week for doping. As Olympic runner Mara Yamauchi points out, Hamera-Shmirko's victories at the Osaka Women's Marathon robbed several Japanese runners of wins in their home country. And just this past weekend, residents of Hamburg, Germany voted against a bid for the 2024 Summer Olympic Games. Many Germans on social media, like Helmut, you see here, suggest that the brewing doping scandal may have contributed to the bid being rejected. So what started in Russia is now stressing into Europe, Africa, and Asia, and it's likely to get worse before it gets better. Where will this doping scandal go next, and will your country be affected? You can, of course, always follow along with #VOA on Twitter and Instagram at #VOA, and on Facebook at facebook.com/#VOA for the latest on what's become a global doping crisis. Back to you, Michael.
Thanks, Andrew. Well, let's have a look now at how America is being affected by doping. And I wanted to put this question to Scott in Maine. America doesn't seem to have as big a problem with doping as Russia and Kenya. So I'm wondering why that is.
It's a good question. I would say that I would back up actually and say that distinguish between the situation here in the States and some other countries and the Russian one especially. And the Russian one is systematic. It works its way through the whole system. Our system here in the U.S. is very much more loosey-goosey. You sort of come up on your own as a runner, and then if you get good enough, then you are the sort of person who's on a national team. Whereas in some countries, including Russia, that's much more, the state is much more involved. And so from a young age, people are sort of watched to see if they should be part of the national team. And so in that situation, if you have systemic doping, as the evidence indicates there is, then it's much more likely that everybody's going to get caught up in doping. Whereas here, as with your own rise to the top, the decision to dope is a much more individual matter.
Andrew, you wanted to follow up with Scott here.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up, Scott, because I know that you mentioned that there's the difference between the U.S. and other countries, but it seems like on social media, everybody's kind of lumping running together and saying running is corrupt, everyone in running is doping, kind of using running as a collective term. How do U.S. athletes kind of break out of that mold? How do they make that distinction between their program, what they're doing, and what other countries are doing?
That is one of the great problems with doping, in that it makes everybody's performances questionable. And as an individual athlete, I think the best that people can do is to be absolutely upfront about show when you've been tested, show your testing record, answer any questions about anything that might have the slightest hint of potential performance enhancing sort of nefariousness. Unfortunately, that couldn't be construed as a slight invasion of your privacy, but unfortunately, in the environment that we're in, I think that is a necessity for an athlete who wants to have the reputation of a clean athlete.
And we saw that UFC fighter earlier tweeting out his results, so that might actually be something that other athletes start doing, and that becomes a social media trend maybe.
Yeah, if you look on the United States Anti-Doping Agency Twitter feed, they are constantly retweeting. This is sort of a Twitter meme. Athletes are always saying, "Thanks USA Today for waking me up at 6 a.m. today for my urine test. I'm happy to participate in clean sport."
Well, that's an early wake-up call. I have a question for Ellis here. We heard from Andrew actually about how some Germans are being turned off the Olympic brand because of these scandals. I wanted to get a sense from you about how the scandals are affecting the Olympics that are coming right up in Rio next year.
Well, first of all, I don't think the Germans were put off by the doping scandal. I just think they're put off by how expensive it is to stage the Olympic Games, and how the local taxpayers are going to have to fund it. So I think that's really the scare factor that's putting the Germans off. The next question is how it will affect the Olympic Games. Well, I don't think it will actually, Michael. I think that people will still be as interested and excited and thrilled by the Olympic Games as they were before this doping scandal. I really don't think the audiences mind that much. I know that we've been sold this idea by the traditional media that doping is wrong and it's cheating and it kind of nullifies the accomplishments of athletes. But frankly, I don't think all these fans that have been watching sports over the years, if we just tap them on the shoulder and said, hey, most of this was actually affected by doping in some way, I don't think they could retrospectively turn around and say, oh, well, we didn't enjoy it after all. I mean, ask baseball fans, for example, whether they've enjoyed the past 20 years. They'll say yes. I really just don't think it matters that much to fans. I know the people who are tweeting us are all, condemning doping in one way or another. But of course, those who either silently approve of it or are even athletes themselves who are participating in it aren't really likely to tweet or say anything about it, because they know that most world sports today, and I'm probably not going to make myself very popular by saying this, but doping does have a presence, and it's a presence that we will simply not be able to get rid of, not in my lifetime, and I doubt in any of you guys' lifetimes either.
Well, we're going to find out what our other panelists think of that idea when we come back for more discussion and final thoughts right after this break. Stay with us.
I'm Jim Malone, and I work the political beat. I cover what drives the political issues in the United States, what voters think, what drives the candidates, how public opinion shifts on one issue or another. It keeps you in touch with the American people and where they want the country to go. It's a great way to get a window on what's happening in the United States. I'm Jim Malone, and my beat is U.S. politics.
Like us on Facebook at #VOA.
Welcome back to #VOA. I'm Michael Lippin in Washington. I wanted to put a question right to Dave here in the studio. Do you think fans really do care whether there's doping or not, or the sponsors care for that matter, whether there's doping or not affecting the Olympics?
I do, and I think the reason that people do is because it basically turns genuine competition into theater, right? And I mean, when we're now looking at, I think the one-off case where it's perhaps off the radar is maybe the case that our other commentator was talking about, where people would say, look, one out of 100, fine. But what we've identified now, when you look at the doping samples that have been released by ARD and the Sunday Times, they raise questions about a third of the medalists in competitions. 1 in 3 athletes who's medaling in athletics has at least a question as to what their doping results and status is. If that is the case, then I think we have a whole different ball of wax where you could have an audience, and it's certainly a case with me and the people that I know, where you say, you know what, if this really isn't valid competition based on merit, do I really want to spend my time? I'm much less interested in the sport if I know that it's a charade. And I think that goes to the heart of what we're talking about. And if 1 in 3 medals is based between 2001 and present day has questions surrounding it, and we may actually have to retroactively award medals and shift people around, I think it takes away from the very purpose of watching the sport. And I think that's going to drive people away.
Right, and I wanted to turn to Scott here. Do you think people are going to be driven away by all of this?
Unfortunately, yes. I think I agree with David that when people watch international world-class running, they want to think that they're seeing an interesting race and not sort of the running equivalent of the World Wrestling Federation. And so if there is enough damning evidence in the short term, it will hurt things in the short term. The hope is that by enough problems now being corrected would then lead to the potential of greater long-term interest if there's greater certainty on the part of the public that what they're seeing is legitimate competition.
Well, a question for Ellis now. What more do you think the World Anti-Doping Agency and the IAAF can do or should do to deal with this problem?
Well, both the World Anti-Doping Agency and the IAAF and any other testing authority in the world have shown themselves utterly incompetent because they simply are always going to be behind the curve. There are methods of doping and types of drugs out there that they simply cannot even contemplate. They don't have names for them. They don't know which athletes are using them, where they're getting them from, and what kind of dosages they're taking them. They are clueless. And so let's not kid ourselves. What WADA catches is probably the tip of the iceberg. And I think everybody in the IAAF and all sports beyond know that WADA is ineffective. I simply don't believe that this is a controllable phenomenon. I can remember myself, I'm old enough to remember the Ben Johnson case in 1988. And there was a declaration of war on doping immediately after that. Here we are in the third decade after that, and the problem, so to speak, is more pronounced and widespread today than it was back in the 1980s. Athletes have made their intentions signally clear to everybody. They will keep taking dope, no matter what, and they will endeavor and succeed at staying ahead of the curve. I think that the only rational solution to this problem is simply to make it disappear. And the way we do that is say to athletes, we will allow you to use dope. In other words, as it was before the 1970s. And don't forget, doping was perfectly legal before the 1970s. So if we could return to that and somehow persuade the sponsors, and I really do think that this whole crusade is motivated by the sponsors not wishing to have their products or their brands associated with the word drugs. If they could be convinced in some way that these are not drugs that conjure in the imagination images of the meddling drug cartels or crack-addled mothers selling their babies for drugs, etc. If we can somehow persuade them that this is an entirely different kind of substance and is used for utterly different kind of purposes, then I think if we can get them on board, sport will have to kind of recreate itself in a way that's more congruent.
Sorry, Ellis, to cut you off. I just wanted to let you know that Andrew wanted to follow up with a question for you.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the social media and ask you, Dave. We see a lot of these athletes calling for crackdowns or publishing their test results saying we're clean. We see a lot of fans doing a lot of complaining on social media, but there's not maybe a lot that fans can do action-wise, or is there on social media? What's the thing that they can do? I mean, they obviously can't post their test results or things as athletes can, but how can they use social media to take action and kind of change what's going on?
Well, I think a great
to bring about what result.
Sorry, that was a question for Dave. Sorry.
Well, I think a great thing that fans can do is use social media to educate, right? For example, there are some athletes who are maligned as dopers who in actual fact use Adderall, which is an attention deficit disorder, right?
Or cold medications, things like that.
Right, and so, and their second violation, right? They're now labeled for eternity this huge doper, when in fact, attention deficit disorder medication is given away like candy in this country to kids across the board, and yet, in many instances, you're now labeled a doper. So we need to educate people about what this world that this world exists. We need to educate people about what WADA is, what doping is, what are the parameters for this culture so that we can create a clean sport. People who educate their ecosystem of followers on social media have a very powerful knock-on effect, because what happens, as we all know, from the Arab Spring to everything else, social media is a great education tool, and that's what people can do.
And I just wanted to bring in Scott for one last question, just briefly if you can. What would you like to see people do regarding doping going forward?
I would, in addition to what David just said, I would say keep the faith, and perhaps I appreciate Ellis's perspective. I thought I was the most cynical person in the world, but I guess I'm not. I would say that to not give up the hope for cleaner competition. There are many things that we as a society have made large-scale efforts to improve, poverty, racism, etc.
Yes,
but we don't.
Thanks, Scott. We have to unfortunately leave it there, but we could go on for a while, I think. Great conversation today. Thanks all of you, to all of our guests, David Larkin here in the studio, Scott Douglas with Runner's World in Maine, and Ellis Cashmore in Birmingham. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to Andrew. And on behalf of everyone in this team, we would like you to visit our website, voanews.com/#VOA. You can also tweet us at #VOA. I'm Michael Lippin in Washington. We'll see you next time.